Howdy, I'm Jammer. I know, I know what you're gonna say. I trimmed my beard. It was just time to do it. So, I've mentioned before time or two on this video that I grew up in East Texas, and as I've also been very fond of reminding people, I'm a white dude from East Texas. Now, I attended a private Christian school in East Texas. Shocker. But one of the most important aspects of that is it had a very insulating influence, particularly in terms of the kind of people that I tended to interact with. They were mostly white, upper class or upper middle class kids. I would probably say, in all fairness, mid to upper middle class. I wasn't one of the rich kids at school, but I wasn't necessarily poor either. I tended to encounter a lot of people who were in the same class group as me, the same racial group as me. There was not a lot of ethnic variety either. There was perhaps one student in my graduating class who was Jewish, and there were only two students who were black, and then there were virtually no Asian Americans and no Latinx. So, one of the most, impacting aspects of that development was the fact that my world tended to have a particular sound. It was a lot of Christian rock, which... Ugh. We moved past it. But alongside that, there was also a fair amount of just rock and roll, period. Both of my parents grew up in the 1980s, so I remember listening to a lot of Aerosmith. There was a lot of Van Halen. There was a lot of Led Zeppelin and Queen. And then to some extent, some smaller band, or air quotes, smaller bands that weren't as sort of pronounced in the rock and roll scene. And then, of course, because I was a kid of my particular generation, I listened to bands like Fall Out Boy, I listened to Green Day. It was just the stuff that I tended to listen to. Now, honestly, I don't listen to a lot of that stuff anymore. Most of the stuff that I listen to today tends to be a lot of old blues from the 1920s. You're talking about guys like Charlie Patton, Barbecue Bob. You also tend to listen to a lot of jazz artists like Thelonious Monk and John Coltrane, Coleman Hawkins, what have you. That tends to be the kind of music I tend to listen to. But I bring this all up because it does relate to what today's comic book is. And hopefully somebody sort of recognized it by now. There's a pronounced absence of one music genre, and that was rap. I never really listened to rap. Like, the only rap that I bothered to listen to when I was younger was pretty much the Run DMC crossover with Aerosmith when they did Walk This Way. And that was about it. Because the environment, the culture, the world that I live in, there just wasn't a lot of people around me who were legitimately interested in rap. And then also, in terms of the genre, we have to recognize that rap is addressing, like all music is, the worldview and the reality of people's lifestyle and their day-to-day lives. Again, when you're talking about rock and roll, it tends to be very working class. It tends to be a lot of people playing guitars, talking about getting drunk and flirting with pretty girls. Rap doesn't necessarily differ that much from it, but it also addresses aspects like police brutality and wealth inequality. And that's something that I'm surrounded by a lot of rich white kids. I never really got that. It wasn't really until I got to college and I began to sort of expand my social orbit that I really began to encounter rap for the first time. And hopefully, as my t-shirt here demonstrates, one of the most important bands for my sort of opening awareness was ultimately Wu-Tang Clan. Enter the 36th Chamber is still, in my mind, one of the greatest albums ever made. And rap as a genre has recently made a lot of headway in terms of gaining more and more cultural, air quote, respectability, though I'm hesitant to use that because, like, it's already a respectable genre. Nobody has to argue for it at this point. But in the year 2019, the rapper Kendrick Lamar did something that nobody had done before, which was he won a Pulitzer Prize for this album here, Damn. This record is the first rap record ever to be nominated and to win a Pulitzer Prize. And that's significant, but because just about every previous Pulitzer Prize winner album has typically been a jazz album. So we have come full circle in trying to understand the fact that rap is not just a sort of basement musical genre. It's now an effective cultural staple. It is intimately invested in terms of our culture, our fashion, our public conscious awareness, and then just in terms of just economics period, it's the building stone for a lot of economic development in our world. What does any of this have to do with comics? Well, I've also mentioned before, maybe once or twice, that I work at a library and that I tend to do a lot of the shelving and sort of rearrange it on the graphic novel shelves. And at my library, we got, about a year and a half ago, a new collection that I had noticed before because I'd seen it just coming through the shelves regularly, but I had never really picked it up. And that was Ed Piskor's Hip Hop Family Tree. Again, this was something that I had seen, but I had never actually taken the effort to really be like, what is that? I want to know more. And so, for whatever reason, I decided it was finally time to sit down and actually just read this book, or at least the first volume in the 5 volumes that make up this collection. And I also wanted to bring attention to something as well. When we're talking about this particular book series, we have to recognize that the publisher is none other than Fantagraphics Books. This is the same company that puts out the complete Crumb comics, the complete Zap comics, or smaller, sort of typically European artworks like this one that we'll actually talk about, or that I'll talk about sometime later on this channel, 5,000 kilometers per second. Fantagraphics tends to be a very niche genre, or excuse me, it tends to be a very niche-driven graphic novels. The books in question tend to be more focused upon the concept of comics as an art form. And so hopefully my viewer will recognize the importance and the significance of Fantagraphics tackling a book like this. This book and this series is really important because though it may not be somebody as powerful as, say, DC or that other one that begins with an M or something like that, this is a pretty well-known comics publisher putting out a book about the rap genre. So moving forward, it doesn't hopefully need to be said, but I just want to make the record clear here. Rap is a respectable genre, and one of the best parts about this book is the way it treats it as such. And so part of the joy of this book right off the bat is seeing just somebody who has been so intimately connected with that community making a book by one of the most widely regarded and critically acclaimed book publishers of comics just the world over. So, very long introduction to this video. Let's get in now into what exactly is Hip Hop Family Tree about. Okay, so I've talked a little bit now about how I sort of became aware of the genre of rap, and then ultimately how that sort of influenced my interest in this book as well. Hopefully that introduction will also sort of provide me kind of like a nice parachute for this next section, because the content of Hip Hop Family Tree Volume 1, and in fact all subsequent 4 volumes, is effectively a family tree. It's kind of a pseudo-genealogy. And if you don't know what genealogy is, it's basically the study of lineage and how people have sort of developed and moved about over time. It's where you come from. So if my family was, say, from Scotland, a genealogist would try to track my family tree going back to Scotland. Hip Hop Family Tree is attempting to do the same thing. Rap is a pretty well-established genre at this point. It is a cultural staple. It is a force unto itself. And so the effort of this book is to try to go, hey, we have this immense, incredible genre of music. How exactly did it get started? And so, looking at the first volume here, the first volume is going to look at the first original players in terms of the field of hip-hop and how they were ultimately able to slowly develop the genre. It's easy to forget sometimes in our sort of cultural landscape when guys like Jay-Z are shaking hands and spending time talking to former President Obama. Process that. We have rappers speaking with some of the most highest of elected officials in the country. That suggests right off the bat how much of a staple rap as a genre is. But it's really important to recognize that it's still a relatively new genre, at least in terms of understanding it as a form of music. Rap, as this book demonstrates, really goes back to about this period of sort of like the early to mid-1970s. And in fact, Piskor is really good at pointing out the fact that it was really guys like Cab Calloway, James Brown, and Muhammad Ali. And one of the really cool things about this book is you get just these small portraits of various figures from the rap community who were really influential in terms of getting this genre established. But as Piskor points out at the start of the book, one of the earliest influences of rap was the fact that you had guys like James Brown who, though they didn't really weren't consciously aware of it, were effectively rapping in their shows. And again, performers like Cab Calloway or even boxers like Muhammad Ali, who would generally address the press, would sometimes just effectively rap in their actual works, in their interviews, in their day-to-day conversations. But nobody had really thought up to that point, is this a means of expression the way blues or jazz or country or rock and roll is? At the time, again, nobody really had, because, one, most of the black artists that had been established up to that point had simply used the method of rapping purely as a means of enhancing melody or performance. It wasn't perceived of as a genre to itself. It was perceived more sort of like a tool. Now, something happened in the mid-1970s, and as Piskor points out in the very beginning of the book, you have, right off the bat, as he points out, a lot of African Americans typically living in places like Brooklyn, where the atmosphere is one of severe poverty. There's not a lot of opportunities for people to sort of establish anything in the way of long-term economic prosperity. Now, there again, we're talking statistically here. There's always exceptions to the case. But in this situation, you had a lot of typically poor working-class people who, like most poor working-class people, wanted to find a way to relax after work and just sort of escape from the realities of their life. In this environment, you would get the development of parties. DJs would be playing records by guys like James Brown or other notable artists at the time. But it was, as he points out here in a particular instance, a man by the name of DJ Kool Herc who points out that people be getting funky when this drum beat takes over, but it only lasts for a couple of seconds. When we talk originally about rap, we don't have anything like the musical equipment today where you can just generate a beat and then have a singer sort of sing over that or rap over that. In the early days, you would effectively have to play James Brown's record, and as he notes there, the beat or the drum beat was when people would really start to party, because again, that's the most rhythmically attuned section. So guys like DJ Kool Herc began to recognize, wait a minute, if we found a way to just sort of play just that, we might have an opportunity to get people even more jazzed than they already are during these parties. And then eventually guys like Grandmaster Flash would eventually tweak the actual sound equipment itself to play just those records and effectively repeat those sequences in the records themselves. It's a little thing, but as Piskor points out, it was these early imaginations. It's these early individuals who began to sort of ask the questions of, is there a way to do this? That we effectively see the foundations of rap as a genre. Now, ultimately, again, economics is going to be a key facet here, because when we talk about the genre of rap, we have to recognize that this is primarily an urban phenomenon, in that it's going to take place in large, developed cities. Now, particularly the city of New York, was really instrumental in getting rap to develop as a genre. And as Piskor points out, during the 1970s, let's see, does he have the date? Of course he don't. But sometime in the early to mid-1970s, New York experienced a massive blackout. Historians have still talked about this one, and some people have referred to it as a kind of apocalyptic night, because the moment those lights went out, and the moment the power went out, the city spiraled out of control. And as he demonstrates here, lots of individuals who were living in these kind of poverty-stricken areas immediately used this opportunity for looting. But what's most important here is if you look down here in this bottom panel, there were a significant number of artists in the area, particularly DJs and MCs, who would use this as an opportunity to raid some of the electronics stores. There are some musical historians who have actually pointed out to the fact that this blackout was really instrumental in getting an entire generation of young African Americans who normally wouldn't have been able to afford this kind of equipment the opportunities to then develop their craft as DJs, as MCs. On the surface, it's crime, and it's just shouldn't have been done. But at the same time, it's because of these actions. It's because of these young men and women who stole those sound equipment and speakers that effectively rap was able to develop in the way that it did. Now, one of the aspects of Piskor's book in the first volume is just trying to understand who are all of the original players. And this is where I'm not going to be able to do that. Because, and this is really important, I don't even know all of this. I know a fair amount about rap as a genre because I've watched a fair number of documentaries about it, but sitting down and trying to tell you the difference between, say, DJ Disco Wiz, Grandmaster Caz, Keith Cowboy, Kid Creole, MC Sharrock, Bill Curtis, DJ Tony Tone, I'm not going to know it. And I'm never going to pretend to know it. So if you want all of those details, get this book. Because what this book does is it's not particularly centered around one individual. In fact, the book tends to be very episodic, hopping from guys like Grandmaster Flash to then hopping on to some of the producers who were developing the area, some of the businessmen who were developing in the area, promoters who were really instrumental in getting some of these MCs out and about, and basically just creating buzz for these bands. Hip Hop Family Tree is trying to show you the fact that rap as a genre was not something like a think tank where you have one clustered group of individuals steadily building towards an overall idea. Rap, very much true to any genre of art, was a concerted effort by a bunch of people doing their own thing that eventually started to generate some type of pattern that people eventually clued into. It took guys like Grandmaster Flash just playing with his sound equipment, and then somebody else going, hey, maybe what we could do is sort of mark the vinyls with a marker so that we would know exactly where the beat was. And then somebody going, well, if I play with this mixer here for a bit, I can get the needle to hop over just this particular section here. And then some 12-year-old kid going, hey, if I pull the record back, it creates this kind of like warpy sound, and that can kind of generate another aspect to the beat. Hip Hop Family Tree shows you that you had a lot of people in a sort of small clustered area who were doing a lot of independent things, but somehow or another managed to create one of the most influential and important genres of music. And that's what's really cool about Volume 1, is it shows you that rap was not just a brainchild. It was very much a community-driven movement. And that's probably, at least to my mind, one of the most really cool aspects of this book, because it was an eye-opener to me. We tend to see music as something that's very well established, or perhaps, especially in this day and age where so many musicians come about and they're on Instagram and Twitter, and they have sort of, I'm going to sound super old there when I say that. The point is, you have superstar musicians. But what's important here is that this first volume really shows how a lot of these early rappers were not super megastars. They were people who lived right down the street, people who were just playing and tinkering with things, people you might have walked into on a day-to-day basis. And that is something that's really instrumental when we talk about the idea of musicians being a part of the culture that they live in. I could keep going, but I just recognize now I'm at 10 minutes, so I don't know really how much more I can say about the content of this book, except for the fact that following the story, Piskor tries to focus on a handful of individuals who were really influential in developing the business of rap, developing the sound of rap, developing some of the technology of rap, and then developing ultimately the culture that is the genre of rap. And this is something I'll hopefully talk a little bit more about in subsequent videos as I begin to read the remaining 4 volumes in this collection. But in this first volume, I really want you to get the idea that it seems, content-wise, kind of jumbled and all over the place, but that's kind of by design and by the reality of the situation. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither was rap. I don't take that back. I actually kind of like that. That sounds good. Somebody, please don't patent that so I can keep the t-shirt rights. Anyway, or if you do manage to copyright the t-shirt rights, at least throw me a buck, please. Anyway, In terms of content, Hip Hop Family Tree is a really great book, and it's a really informative book. It's another opportunity to see how comics as a medium can be really great at doing more than just telling a story, but also being extraordinarily informative in terms of its approach. Now, looking at that, let's now also sort of talk about here why I think Hip Hop Family Tree is really interesting from a formalist perspective. Because as interesting as it is in terms of just the content itself, it's also really interesting as a visual medium as well. Okay, so small correction. I ended that last segment saying that this book is an interesting visual medium. This book is not a medium. It just has a lot of interesting visual structures. Just words. What are those, right? Anyway, we've talked now about why I think the content of Hip Hop Family Tree Volume 1 is really cool, and why I think Ed Piskor does a really good job with it. But on top of just the actual content itself, which is incredibly researched, and even better at the very end actually has a bibliography, which I have to show off because I am a sucker for bibliography. Look at that. Look at that. Is that not the most beautiful thing you've ever seen? You can go in and find all of the references, see all these cool books about the history of rap and the individuals that made it. It's beautiful. But this is actually a really good opportunity to talk about, in terms of the structure of the book, a bibliography is not really something that you would observe at the very end of a graphic novel, because even the nonfiction graphic novels that I've read, some of them don't incorporate bibliographies. They might have, hey, here's an interesting list of books you might want to check out, but this demonstrates, at least in my mind, and I feel like I need to just humble brag here maybe a little bit, my training in order to get my master's degree really taught me how important it was to cite your sources. And especially something where rap, where there is so much speculation and there is so much more oral history than there is sometimes in terms of the actual paper-driven, record-driven history, it's nothing short of impressive that the reader gets something like this at the very end of the book. But now in terms of the visual language of the book itself, I want to bring attention, again, I opened up to this first page, and you'll note right off the bat, the pages look a little weathered. That's not because a million people have checked this book out. Instead, this is something very similar and akin to Seth's It's a Good Life If You Don't Weaken. If you remember when we talked about that book, the pages in question have a sort of yellowed effect to them. That's because Seth in the book is sort of continually sort of thinking about the old issues of the New Yorker and old issues of the Esquire. He's constantly thinking about a world that no longer exists, or at least he doesn't perceive that it exists anymore. Hip Hop Family Tree is very much trying to structure itself visually like that. It's trying to make some kind of a family tree or a family genealogy, and so naturally, the pages look weathered. This is to show you, again, that he's trying to create some kind of record to talk about the existence of hip-hop as a genre, and that this is supposed to be some kind of record. It's a little thing that's kind of easy to miss, but we have to remember that by doing this to the pages, it has an effect upon the reader. The way you see color affects you and impacts you. And so constantly throughout reading this book, regardless of what's taking place on the page, those borders and what's taking place in terms of the gutters between the panels still has that faded quality to it. It doesn't look clean and pretty. You get the idea that this is a kind of, or you at least perceive, this feels kind of like an artifact, like I'm stumbling upon sort of these old photos and oral histories of a bunch of people that aren't around anymore. And in the way, I think it's really cool. It, again, contributes to the idea that, hey, we're trying to tell a kind of family history here, or a kind of just history book period. But at the same time, this weathered effect is also really good at sort of reminding the reader of the fact that rap, especially in its early foundation, was not a sort of clean-cut packaged product. People in the early days of rap were still figuring out, what exactly is this? Is it anything at all? Or are we just trying to throw parties and shit? If you look at one particular page on page 14 of the book, you see one particular concert when some of the MCs are playing, and you'll see that the bass is so heavy that it's almost like it's affecting the very words and ink that's printed on the paper as well. This is, again, a nice sort of visual clue that Piskor is using to create the effect on the reader that even if you can't hear that heavy, thick bass, you know it, because at some point you've probably been driving down the road and somebody has their subwoofers at full blast and they're playing somebody and you're like, these damn kids in their rock and roll. God, I sounded a little too old when I did that. Ugh. Whatever the case, this is a nice visual effect, and it demonstrates that Piskor is aware of the fact that he's not trying to just use words in order to tell the story. He's using the visual language that's possible through the medium of comics in order to convey certain ideas and attitudes. And along with that as well, there's just a lot of really good visual structures in the story itself. There's a lot of attention paid to color. There's a lot of attention paid to the way that you're framing up these shots. Again, looking at something like a news documentary that Hugh Downs did about the genre of rap, you could have just shown a TV, but instead he actually tries to reproduce the opening sort of, promotional credit, and then an actual image of Hugh Downs himself, while on the previous page showing people in the club listening to music and having a party. It's little choices throughout the course of this book, but it's still an effective choice that really manages to work. One of the interesting things about this book, too, is the way that as vinyl became more and more of an established structure for rap musicians, he'll take the time and effort to reproduce the record labels. And that may not seem terribly, relevant, but it's important to recognize that the only other artist I've really seen do something like that is Robert Crumb, whenever he, again, does comics about, say, Charlie Patton. That's something you don't typically see in documentaries or see in comics about musicians, or at least I haven't. Again, it's an attempt to show you what it would have actually looked like. It's almost sort of like a scrapbook, like a cutout of the record that's just been pasted right there into the book. But at the same time, as he notes here, when you're looking at, say, Lister Hugh Lovey, owner of the reggae label Clappers Records, decided to produce socially conscious rap records juxtaposed against Lynn's more upbeat music. The song is largely about black oppression by whites and ultimately about violent revolution in order to sort of change the status quo. If you listen to the song, it sounded like an upbeat tune, but then at the same time, as he points out, using the record label and the art that was included on that record label, you sort of see the effort that was being made by that particular musician. And then, finally, one last sort of important thing is that in terms of panel arrangements, Piskor is really good at making sure his page never becomes static. You'll have pages like this where you'll see individuals interacting on the street, or you'll see people sort of talking about money in the record industry, recording in rap songs. But then you'll also get things like this, where you may not get an entire full-page spread, but you'll get about half of this page taken up to see this character being told, hey, we're going out on the road with the Commodores. This is a concern to make sure that there's an energy going on in this book, because Piskor isn't telling just sort of like a static academic history here. He's trying to engage his reader and remind you or show you that there was a lot of energy in the early days of rap. It was something that was changing every single day, and there were so many players all fighting to be the top dog in this new genre. And so this goes a long way in demonstrating, again, the notion that comics is not simply about filling up square panels with pretty pictures. It's also about using the interiors and the size of panels as a way of conveying emotional aspects, or emotional qualities to the narrative itself. I'm at 8 minutes, so I probably shouldn't say too much more, but hopefully you get the idea now that Hip Hop Family Tree Volume 1 is really interesting for the ways that it plays with the medium visually. It doesn't just set up a bunch of panels and just fill them up. Instead, there's a lot of concern for the way the whole book looks, the way the paper feels in the hands of the actual reader itself, and then using visual clues, including onomatopoeia, but then also just general line work as well, in order to convey ideas and realities that may not have been as easily translatable with just a couple of words or a couple of lines on the page. There's a real notion in Hip Hop Family Tree Volume 1 that you can do things with comics, and that you can really express energy, dynamicism. Is that a word? Fuck it, I'm going to make it a word now. Dynamicism. OED, look it up. don't look it up. It may not actually exist. There's energy to this book, and it's translated intimately and directly into the medium itself. And so anybody who loves comics really should take the time and check this series out, because it's amazing. And so now, with all that said and done, let's do the last hurrah. Call it a day. I need new material. All right. So, what need else be said other than Wu-Tang Clan ain't nothing to fuck with, and be humble. Hip Hop Family Tree Volume 1 by Ed Piskor is an amazing book, and I'm really, really glad that I read it, because it gave me an opportunity to sort of observe rap as a genre, but more importantly, see the humanity behind it, because perhaps one of the most interesting things about any genre of music is seeing how it began to develop and change over time. And that's something that's really important, especially when we talk about music and musicians, period. I said it once already, but we have a tendency sometimes, I think, to forget that the people on stage who seem so powerful and so glamorous are ultimately people who came from a community. They are individuals with a wealth of experiences who are trying to communicate their reality and connect with the people that they're singing to. What's interesting about this first volume is you really see how that first generation of rappers, guys like Grandmaster Flash, were not superstars cultivated by production companies. They were people out on the street who were playing parties to make their bread, and then somehow or another managed to stumble upon what would ultimately be a kind of cultural renaissance for music. We have now, regardless of whatever you think about the genre of rap, now permanently fixed with it as a means of expression. And it's because of the people in this first volume that guys like Run DMC and Snoop Dogg and Dr. Dre and Kendrick Lamar are able to just wow audiences and give us just wonderful, incredible music. I can't say enough about this book. Content-wise, it's inspiring, just as a music lover, period. And then in terms of just a comics fan, there's so much that this book offers in terms of using color, in terms of panel layouts, in terms of using the visual language, in terms of using onomatopoeia, in terms of all the elements that we talked about in that whole Understanding Comics 9-part series. Hip Hop Family Tree gives the reader a lot. And so anybody who loves comics or anybody who loves hip-hop and rap is going to find something to love about it. In case I haven't made the case already, go read this book, man. Come on. All right, I'm going to call it a day there. Thank you so much for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. All that jazz lets me know that you like these videos and you want to see more. When it comes to Hip Hop Family Tree, this is Volume 1, and I do have every intention of doing all 5 volumes, but as I have shown you, there's a lot of books around me at all times, and I only have so many days in my life to read them all and then also find time to record them. So I promise there will be more of the Hip Hop Family Tree. I just don't know when I'm going to get to it. Just stay tuned, keep your eyes open, and as soon as I do, I'll make sure to post it. Also, when it comes to Hip Hop Family Tree, it's a Fantagraphics book, so it probably will be located at your local comic book shop. If they don't have it, they'll probably be able to order it for you. As far as I'm aware, it's still in print, but I may be wrong about that. I probably should have checked beforehand. But check with your local comic book shop dealer, because they'll be able to give you a better answer than I can. Also, again, this copy that I'm handling here is the one from my local public library, so don't forget, you live in a country that has local public libraries where, as long as you're paying property taxes to the county or the city, you've already paid for your card, so why not take advantage of that? More and more libraries are purchasing graphic novels. Go check it out. If they don't have this collection, you can always request it through an interlibrary loan. And then finally, in summation, as always, thank you so much for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. Go read some comics.